London, 1811. The air was thick with soot and fog, the kind that clung to your clothes and crept into your lungs, leaving behind the bitter taste of coal and decay. The streets were narrow veins of shadow, lined with crumbling brick and the faint glow of lanterns struggling against the dark. Horses pulled carts heavy with goods, their hooves striking the cobblestones in dull rhythm, while hawkers shouted prices for bread, for fish, for ale. Yet amid the noise of daily survival, there was one stall that drew eyes, one family whose trade stirred whispers even before the truth had surfaced. The Butcher family. At first glance, they seemed ordinary, an unremarkable clan running a modest meat stall, their knives flashing with practiced ease, their aprons stained with the crimson proof of their labor. Customers came because the prices were lower, the portions larger, the cuts tender in ways that other stalls could not match. Men chewed with satisfaction. Women marveled at the richness of the meat. Children licked the fat from their fingers without question. But beneath the everyday exchange of coin for flesh, there was something sinister, something that pulsed in the silence of the market when no one dared to speak aloud their doubts. In the heart of London, where poverty was rampant and the gap between wealth and desperation yawned like a grave, hunger made people blind. Few asked why the butchers never seemed to run out of supply. Even when livestock was scarce, few wondered how in times of shortage their stall overflowed with abundance. Those who questioned too loudly often disappeared, their absence swallowed by the chaos of the city, leaving behind only unanswered fears. The butchers thrived in this silence, their reputation growing darker in the shadows while their knives kept cutting. The story begins with a market that smelled not just of pork and beef but of something heavier, sweeter and more sickly than honest food should. The smell haunted the streets, lingering in the nostrils of those who passed by, stirring unease in their bellies even as they devoured their meals. The children sang songs in cruel jest, whispering about sausages filled with beggars, pies baked with the flesh of drunks who wandered too close. Most dismissed such rhymes as the fancies of youth, but the fear they carried was too sharp to be entirely imagined. There were stories that the butchers bought no livestock, that no one ever saw pigs led into their yard or cows driven to their chopping blocks. There were stories of night wagons that rattled into their shop under cover of darkness, wagons that never returned, wagons that smelled of sweat, of blood, of despair. And then there were the missing, the lost souls of London, the forgotten poor, the drunks who stumbled home and never arrived, the women whose screams were muffled before dawn. Their names were not recorded in ledgers, their faces not missed by society, but their absence was felt in the marrow of the city. People whispered of them, quietly, nervously, knowing that to speak too loud was to invite notice from the very family they feared. The Butcher family was more than just traders of meat. They were predators hiding in plain sight, wolves dressed as neighbors, carving their fortunes from the flesh of those too weak to defend themselves. Their knives were not only tools of trade but instruments of terror, and with each slice they wove themselves deeper into the nightmares of London. To understand their rise is to step into a world where morality decays as quickly as the corpses left in unmarked graves, where survival eclipses conscience, and where human life is measured not in worth but in weight, in cuts, and the price of a meal. It is to understand how a city hungry for food, blind to the vanishing poor, and drunk on its own indifference could become the perfect hunting ground for a family of butchers who fed not on livestock, but on mankind. Their story is not merely one of crime but of horror, of society's silence and of a darkness that thrived not in back alleys alone, but in the very heart of commerce, where greed and hunger met. Picture the market at dusk, the last of the day's light fading into shadows. The butcher's stall still buzzes with activity while others close, their knives gleaming as they slice meat that glistens with juices too rich, too strange to belong to ordinary beasts. A woman leans in, asks the price of ribs, and smiles as she carries home what she believes is pork, her children waiting with eager eyes. But what she sets on the table that night carries screams within its fibers, the echo of hands once raised in protest, the silence of a voice forever stilled. They eat, they laugh, they live, and the butchers smile as another family feasts on a secret too terrible to name. In the alleys nearby, dogs sniff at discarded scraps, whining with confusion, their instincts recoiling at what human eyes refuse to see. The night carries the cries of the lost, but the city does not listen. It is this silence that made the butchers strong. This silence that kept their knives busy, their coffers full, their crimes hidden. In a city that turned away from its own shadows, they found a kingdom of flesh, a reign of terror carved not in stone but in blood and bone. The Butcher family's story is not just about murder, it is about the machinery of horror that turns neighbors into prey, about the blindness of society that allows monsters to thrive. It is about hunger, greed, and the macabre feast that London unknowingly joined. As the fog thickens, as the lanterns dim, and as the shadows stretch across the cobblestones, the tale of the Butchers unfolds, a tale that stains the history of London with blood not from beasts but from its own forgotten sons and daughters. And so the question lingers, sharp as the blade of a cleaver. When the market bustled, when the coins clinked, when the plates were full, how many feasts were truly meals of survival, and how many were suppers of the damned? London in 1811 was a city of contradictions, a place where wealth and ruin lived side by side, where glittering mansions towered above alleys filled with filth and despair. The Industrial Revolution was clawing its way forward, belching smoke into the sky and filling pockets of the privileged, while the poor rotted in cramped slums that smelled of sewage and sickness. Hunger was everywhere, stalking the streets like a beast, gnawing at the bones of the desperate. Food was scarce, prices high, and the working class often found themselves choosing between starvation or the cheapest scraps they could buy. It was in this bleak world that the Butcher family carved their trade, presenting themselves as humble providers of nourishment, yet hiding a darkness that fed not only on flesh but on the silence of a society too broken to question. Their shop sat in a narrow lane of Whitechapel, a neighborhood already infamous for its poverty and crime. By day, the streets buzzed with vendors selling goods from carts, ragged children darting between stalls, and beggars stretching out their hands with hollow eyes. By night, the same streets transformed into corridors of danger, where thieves and cutthroats hunted like wolves. In this setting, the Butchers thrived, their stall lit by flickering lamps, their cleavers glinting as they worked, their faces calm, almost welcoming, as if they were neighbors rather than predators. The family's origins were murky, whispered about in taverns but never confirmed. Some said they had come from the countryside, forced into London by failed harvests, bringing with them an unnatural hunger. Others swore they had been in Whitechapel for generations, their bloodline steeped in cruelty, each child taught not just to cut meat, but to cut life itself. Whatever the truth, by 1811 they were an established presence, known as much for their cheap prices as for the unease they inspired. The patriarch was a heavy-set man with arms thick from years of chopping, his face set in an expression that never quite reached his eyes. His wife, pale and sharp-featured, handled customers with a smile that many swore looked more like a sneer. Their children, silent and obedient, moved like shadows between the front stall and the rooms behind, carrying trays of meat that no one could trace to any farm. What set the Butchers apart was not just their constant supply, but the quality of the meat itself. It was tender in ways that astonished customers, rich in flavor even when cooked plain. Housewives boasted of meals that made their families forget the misery of hunger for a night. Workers chewed with satisfaction as they licked grease from their fingers, and all the while none asked why the taste lingered in their mouths long after the meal was done, why the satisfaction felt so heavy, so wrong. London in those years was not a place where questions were safe. The poor had no voice, the missing had no one to speak for them, and the authorities cared little for those who vanished from the gutters. Everyday bodies turned up in the Thames, in alleyways and ditches, yet no one stopped to count, no one demanded answers. It was a city that devoured its own, and the Butchers took advantage of this silence with ruthless skill. Their stall became a place where hunger met horror, though few realized it until it was far too late. The rumors began slowly, like smoke curling from a hidden fire. A sailor claimed he recognized the shape of a cut as too human. A washerwoman whispered that she smelled something unnatural in her stew. But rumors in London were like rats everywhere, breeding endlessly, and so these whispers were ignored, drowned out by the cries of the market and the endless need to eat. Still, those who lived nearest to the Butchers spoke of strange noises at night, muffled thuds, cries that ended too quickly, the scrape of something heavy being dragged across stone. They spoke of wagons arriving under cover of fog, driven by faces no one recognized, unloading burdens that never reappeared. Yet no one dared confront the family directly, for the Butchers were feared. Their knives were sharp, their eyes sharper, And in a world where life was cheap, to cross them was to risk disappearing into the same shadows that swallowed so many. The background of their reign is not merely one of a family business, but of a city complicit in silence. The authorities did not look, the neighbors did not speak, and the customers did not care so long as their bellies were filled. Hunger makes accomplices of us all, and in 1811 London, hunger was king. The butchers knew this, and they thrived because of it, turning the suffering of the city into their own grim empire. Their background is a portrait of survival twisted into horror, of a family that saw opportunity in desperation, and of a city that allowed monsters to walk openly because to face the truth was far more terrifying than to keep eating in ignorance. And so their knives kept cutting, their stall kept selling, and the line between beast and man blurred until flesh was flesh, coin was coin, and morality was nothing more than another corpse left to rot unseen in the dark. The deeper one looks into the butcher family, the clearer it becomes that their existence was stitched into the fabric of London's misery. Whitechapel was their hunting ground and hunger was their weapon. They understood the rhythm of the city. When the pubs emptied and the drunks staggered through the fog, when the homeless curled into doorways seeking warmth, when the desperate sought shelter in exchange for a coin or two, these were the moments the butchers chose, striking not with violence in the open but with a quiet efficiency that left few traces. The patriarch was often seen at odd hours, moving through the alleys with a lantern, his boots slick with mud and worse. He knew where the forgotten slept, where the weak lingered, and he knew no one would mourn them. London was a city where the poor disappeared every day, swallowed by disease, by crime, by despair. To vanish in Whitechapel was no tragedy. It was expected. The butchers used this truth as their cloak. Behind the facade of their shop lay a labyrinth of rooms few outsiders ever entered. Customers glimpsed only the front stall, the glistening slabs of meat, the cleavers biting into the blocks, the trays carried in and out by the children. But those who worked nearby swore the building was larger than it appeared, with back rooms that stretched like veins, hidden doors that opened into darkness, and cellars where the air grew heavy with the smell of rot. It was there, they whispered, that the butchers did their real work. The wife was said to be the cruelest, her hands precise, her demeanor calm as she directed the children in their tasks. Some claimed she was the one who devised ways to disguise the cuts, to turn what was once human into pork, beef, or lamb with a butcher's art so perfect, it fooled even the sharpest eye. Others said she took pleasure in the work, humming lullabies as her knives sliced through sinew and bone, her voice drifting through the shop like a ghost's song. The children, pale and silent, moved with unnatural discipline. They were never seen playing, never heard laughing, always carrying trays or scrubbing blocks, their eyes dull as if the horrors they witnessed had hollowed them out. Neighbors wondered if they had known anything else, if cruelty was not just their inheritance but their only education. What sort of monsters does a family create when blood and flesh are their lessons, when knives are their toys, when screams are their lullabies? The butchers existed in a world that allowed such monstrosity to grow unchecked. The law was blind, but not merely out of ignorance. Constables in London were poorly paid, easily bribed, and utterly uninterested in the disappearances of those who could not pay taxes or wield influence. A coin slipped into the right hand, a haunch of meat gifted to the right mouth, and the butcher's crimes melted into the background noise of a city already drowning in sin. In this way, they built their shield not from secrecy but from audacity. They operated openly, daring anyone to challenge them, knowing that hunger and corruption would always keep their blades sharp and their business safe. To the wealthy who occasionally ventured into Whitechapel, the butchers were invisible, just another part of the squalor they chose to ignore. To the poor, they were both salvation and curse, feeding them while feeding on them, offering nourishment with one hand and death with the other. It was a grotesque cycle, a dance of complicity in which every coin exchanged became a silent pact of denial. Some did suspect. A few brave souls whispered louder, warning their neighbors not to buy, claiming they knew what the butchers truly sold. But hunger silenced them. Even those who believed often returned, clutching their coins, desperate for the only meat they could afford. And when one of those outspoken voices vanished soon after, the warnings died with them. Fear is a powerful gag. The background of the butcher's story is thus painted not only in their own cruelty, but in the failure of society around them. A city that did not value the poor, that did not protect the vulnerable, created the perfect hunting ground for predators disguised as tradesmen. London itself was complicit, its silence feeding the butchers as surely as the flesh of their victims. And so as 1811 wore on, the family stall continued to thrive. The knives kept falling, the trays kept moving, and the line between survival and damnation blurred until it was invisible. Behind the facade of commerce, the butchers carved their legend into the very bones of the city. A legend that even now lingers in whispers, in fears, in the taste of meat too rich to be believed. Their background is not just history. It is a mirror held to a city's darkest corners, a reminder of what horrors are born when hunger rules and humanity is cheap. The first whispers began like the scratch of rats behind the walls, faint and easy to dismiss, yet impossible to silence. In the markets of Whitechapel, women trading gossip between baskets of bread leaned close and muttered that the butcher family's meat was too tender, too strange, as if it came not from pig or cow but from something else entirely. A sailor swore he had once seen a joint that resembled a man's arm, the curve of the bone too human to ignore. Another claimed he had bitten into a pie and found a tooth embedded in the filling, though when he returned to confront the butchers, they only smiled with lifeless eyes and told him he must have imagined it. These stories should have been enough to spark outrage, but London was drowning in hunger, and hunger deafens the ear to anything that threatens the next meal. Still, the rumors grew, carried by the fog, repeated in taverns where drunks clutched their mugs with trembling hands and swore they had seen figures dragged into the butcher shop after dark. Some said they heard muffled cries when the streets emptied, cries quickly cut short, followed by the thud of cleavers and the hiss of boiling pots. Children, ever cruel in their innocence, sang songs about sausages stuffed with beggars, about pies baked with the flesh of the lost. At first adults shushed them, but soon even they repeated the rhymes, half in jest, half in fear, as though laughter could shield them from the truth. The butcher family thrived in this atmosphere, never acknowledging the rumors, never defending themselves, but never ceasing to smile as customers lined up day after day. Their stall was always full, their knives never rested, and their supply of meat seemed endless even when other butchers struggled to find scraps. That abundance was itself a whisper, for in a city where famine gnawed at the poor, how could one family's stall remain so bountiful? Some suspected theft from wealthier districts, others believed they traded with smugglers, but a few, braver or more foolish than the rest, dared to voice the darker suspicion that the butcher's supply came not from livestock but from the vanishing poor. The disappearances began to align too neatly. Beggars who once claimed the corners near the market vanished, their spots empty as though they had been swallowed by the fog. Women who stumbled drunk through the alleys were never seen again. Children, too, the kind who wandered too close to the wrong stall, the wrong smile, were gone by dawn. In London, such vanishings were not uncommon, but the pattern was undeniable for those willing to look. The butcher's knives stayed busy, their shop stayed full, and the city's silence deepened. It was not only the poor who whispered. Even the wealthier citizens who ventured into Whitechapel muttered uneasily when they tasted the meat. Too rich, too sweet, too strange, it lingered in the mouth like a memory one wished to forget. Yet no one spoke aloud in daylight. Fear hung heavier than the fog, and those who had dared to question before were already gone, their voices extinguished as easily as candle flames. In the taverns, men whispered about seeing wagons arrive at the butcher's door in the dead of night. Covered wagons, heavy, creaking under loads too great for simple goods. Some swore they saw hands dangling over the side, pale and lifeless, quickly tucked back under the tarp when eyes lingered too long. Others said the wagons returned empty, the horses lathered with sweat, their drivers grim and silent. Yet none confronted the butchers. Fear kept their mouths shut, and hunger drove their hands to pay the coins that bought another cut of meat, another meal for the family. The silence of London was not ignorance. It was complicity, a city choosing not to see what was carved before its eyes. The butcher's children were part of the whispering too, though never with words. They moved like shadows, carrying trays, scrubbing blocks, hauling buckets. Their eyes were flat, void of innocence, reflecting only obedience to the horror around them. Some customers said they saw one child smile faintly when a customer chewed with satisfaction, as if the act of consumption itself was the joke. Others claimed the children stared too long, unblinking, as if measuring each customer's weight, imagining how they would look on a hook. Such stories should have drawn outrage, but in 1811, London outrage was a luxury. The working class did not have the power to confront, and the wealthy did not care so long as the horror remained hidden in the alleys of Whitechapel. Thus the rumors became legend, woven into the city's fabric, a grim tapestry of suspicion and fear. What had begun as a whisper grew into a chorus that no one dared sing aloud in daylight. But in the dark, in the fog, in the silence between footsteps, the truth pressed against the city like a knife waiting to carve. And through it all, the Butcher family kept working. Their stall a stage where every cleaver stroke was both performance and crime. Every smile a mask. Every transaction a pact with the devil. London's fog was a perfect accomplice. It rolled in thick, swallowing the streets, erasing faces and muffling screams. Many nights people swore they heard faint cries beneath the shroud, like voices trapped in the mist only to vanish the moment they strained to listen closer. When the fog cleared by dawn, the cobblestones bore stains that no rain could wash away. Still, the butchers opened their stall on time, blades gleaming, counters wiped spotless, their meat stacked high as if conjured from the night itself. The police, what little force existed for the poor, ignored the whispers. Some said the butchers paid them in coin, others that they fed them in meat. Either way, the silence of law was as heavy as the silence of the people. What was a missing beggar, a missing drunk, a missing orphan to those sworn to keep order? The city was overflowing with the unwanted. Their disappearances were convenient, not suspicious. Hunger kept the citizens blind, fear kept the officials deaf, and together they formed a wall behind which the butchers thrived. The family's house itself became a subject of fascination. Few had been inside, but those who had, delivery boys, apprentices, drunkards who stumbled through the wrong door, never returned unchanged. One survivor, raving in a tavern, swore he had seen hooks hanging from the ceiling, each bearing slabs of meat that were not quite animal. He swore he had seen a face, eyes still open, lips still trembling, in a vat of brine. The others laughed, calling him mad, but his hands shook so violently that the mug spilled before he could drink. He vanished weeks later, his ramblings silenced as surely as the rest. The butcher's matriarch, the mother, was said to be the coldest of them all. While the father carved with the strength of a butcher and the children moved like shadows, she was the one who greeted customers, her voice smooth, her eyes sharp. She knew everyone by name, remembered their favorite cuts, asked about their children as though nothing in the world mattered more. People trusted her, leaned close to share their troubles, never noticing how her gaze lingered on their throats, their arms, their flesh. To speak with her was to step into a web, and once entangled, few ever escaped. Legends whispered that she could tell a person's weight and fat by a single glance, calculating cuts in her head before the cleaver ever fell. In a way, London itself seemed complicit. The very architecture conspired to hide the truth. Narrow alleys twisted like intestines, shadows pooled in every doorway, and the roar of industry drowned the sound of anything one did not wish to hear. The city fed the butchers not just with victims but with secrecy, and the more people whispered, the more those whispers became a shield. After all, if everyone laughed nervously and called it a legend, then surely it could not be real. Yet the unease seeped into dreams. Housewives confessed to waking in the night with the taste of blood on their tongues. Children cried of nightmares in which they were hung from hooks like pigs. Sailors swore the fog itself smelled of roasting flesh when it rolled past the market. The legend became so woven into daily life that people half expected the horror, half depended on it, as though it was not simply an atrocity but a grim rhythm of the city's beating heart. Still, every whisper had a cost. There were those who dug too deep, who asked too many questions, who leaned too close to the truth. And one by one they vanished. A priest who preached against the stall disappeared after vowing to lead a march to close it. His body was never found, but days later the butcher's stall offered sausages richer than ever, their casing snapping with unusual toughness. A constable who claimed to have proof against the family vanished on patrol. His fellow officers dismissed it as desertion, yet weeks later a regular customer swore he saw the man's wedding ring glinting in the bottom of a stew pot before it was scooped out and replaced. The message was clear: silence was survival, and so the city obeyed. By 1811, the legend of the Butcher family had grown too large to ignore, yet too terrifying to confront. They were both myth and reality, their crimes hidden in plain sight, their stall a stage where the audience chose not to see the play. And through it all the whispers never ceased. Do not ask where the meat comes from. Do not linger too long at their stall, and for God's sake do not follow the wagons at night. But hunger is stronger than fear. And so London lined up, coins clinking, stomachs growling, eyes averted, while the butchers smiled and carved and fed a city its own flesh. London's silence was never complete, yet on that winter evening in 1811 the air seemed to hold its breath as if it, too, had learned to fear the butcher family. The rumors had thickened into something more than whispers. They were accusations, cries of outrage, voices of the desperate trying to force the truth into daylight. The city had tolerated the stench, ignored the vanishing beggars, dismissed the uneasy dreams of neighbors who swore they heard screams behind the shuttered windows. But hunger can only blind the eyes for so long. That blindness shattered when evidence spilled into the streets like blood down a gutter. A cart overturned near Whitechapel, its canvas covering ripped open by the wheel of another wagon, and from within tumbled not sacks of pork or lamb but bones. Long, pale bones still slick with gristle, unmistakably human. The crowd gathered, horrified, unable to deny what their minds had long tried to bury. Women screamed, men recoiled. Children cried that the bones looked like their father's arms. The driver fled before the mob could seize him, and the cart, abandoned, became a grotesque altar in the middle of the street. That moment marked the beginning of the end. No rumor could explain it away. No clever smile from the butcher father could turn the horror into commerce. The city had seen too much. Fear gave birth to fury, and the mob that had once fed at the stall now demanded blood for blood. They surged toward the shop, a wave of outrage crashing against the warped timbers of the butcher's door, pounding, shouting, demanding entry. Inside, the family waited, not with pleas or apologies, but with weapons. Knives gleamed in the lamplight, cleavers swung with anticipation. Hooks rattled as though the walls themselves hungered for violence. When the door finally splintered and the first intruders spilled in, they were met not with flight but with slaughter. The butchers fell upon them with a ferocity that defied reason, cutting, hacking, tearing flesh from bone as though the mob were nothing more than livestock brought in for the day's kill. Screams echoed down the street, drowning out prayers, turning the market into a place of execution. The cobblestones ran slick, and the air filled with the metallic tang of fresh blood mingling with the older, sweeter rot that had long lingered around the family's domain. Those who survived stumbled back into the fog, eyes wide, trembling, unable to speak of what they had seen. They had gone to unmask monsters and instead found themselves butchered like beasts. Word spread like wildfire, leaping from tavern to church, from alley to drawing room. London trembled. Some said the butchers were demons wearing human skin. Others claimed they had made a pact with darkness itself, trading their souls for endless meat in a starving city. Whatever the truth, the city could no longer pretend the family was simply odd, eccentric, or cruel. They were killers, cannibals, architects of a nightmare that now stood naked in the open. Authorities, long silent, could no longer ignore the roar of the people. Magistrates debated, constables muttered, soldiers were whispered about, but fear kept many paralyzed. Who would dare storm a fortress of knives knowing what waited inside? The fog over Whitechapel thickened that week, rolling low like a shroud, and within it the butchers continued their grisly work, unfazed by the storm gathering at their gates. Each night the smell grew stronger. Each morning fewer beggars wandered the alleys. Each market day the stalls still opened, stacked with meat that glistened under the pale sun. And yet the customers had changed. No longer eager, they approached cautiously, eyes darting, hands trembling as they exchanged coins for parcels. Some swore the father's smile was wider now, the mother's hands quicker with the knife, the children's eyes brighter with something not of innocence, but of cruelty, learned too young. Still hunger pressed men to silence. They ate, they prayed, they feared. But deep inside the city was boiling. The climax of the nightmare had arrived, and London braced itself for the eruption of horror that would either destroy the butcher family or swallow the city whole. The mob did not retreat forever. Rage is a fire that sputters when doused with fear, but it does not die. It smolders until the right breath of wind sets it ablaze again. London's fury was that wind. The image of human bones spilling from the cart haunted the city's sleep, stirring nightmares of loved ones carved and sold. Men who had once looked the other way now clenched fists and sharpened blades. Women whispered prayers not just for protection but for vengeance. Children were warned never to stray near the butcher's street, yet they still sang cruel rhymes about sausages stuffed with human skin. It was no longer a question of if the family would be confronted, but when. That moment came one storm-lashed night when the bells of Whitechapel tolled and a gathering formed. torches burning in the downpour, shadows flickering against brick and fog. They marched as one, farmers, dock workers, washerwomen, even beggars who had survived long enough to remember the faces of the vanished. At their head strode the parish priest, cross in one hand, iron poker in the other, his eyes burning with the desperate courage of a man who no longer feared death. When they reached the butcher's shop, the windows glowed faintly as if firelight inside mocked their fury. The door stood barred, but the mob had brought axes, crowbars, raw determination. Wood splintered, glass shattered, and the mob poured in. What they found was worse than rumor. The front room was tidy, almost welcoming. Counters scrubbed, knives gleaming, carcasses hanging as though nothing were amiss. But the stench of rot hit like a wall, and beyond a narrow doorway the true horrors waited. Cellars lit by lanterns revealed hooks bearing the remains of men, women, even children flayed and dismembered. Troughs brimmed with congealed blood and barrels held salted limbs stacked like cordwood. Tables displayed grotesque feasts half prepared, pies with human hands baked into their crusts, sausages bursting with pale meat, stews simmering with bones too small to belong to livestock. The mob staggered, some fainted, others vomited, but rage quickly swallowed revulsion. The butcher family stood at the far end, knives in hand, eyes shining with defiance. They did not flee. They did not beg. They attacked. The father charged first, cleaver flashing, splitting a man's skull before he could raise his torch. The mother followed, moving with terrifying speed, slicing the throat of a woman who had come armed only with a kitchen knife. The children, barely more than teenagers, fought with hooks and blades, shrieking with manic joy as they cut into flesh. The cellar became a battlefield, torchlight flickering across blood-slick walls, shadows writhing as steel clashed against fury. For every mob member cut down, two more surged forward, driven not by bravery but by desperation. They had seen the truth, and there could be no turning back. Screams filled the underground chambers, mingling with the crash of overturned barrels and the sickening thud of steel into bone. The fight raged until torches set fire to the wooden beams, flames licking greedily at the ceiling, smoke curling into the choking air. The butchers fought like beasts cornered, but beasts tire and mobs do not. One by one, the family was dragged down. The father's cleaver arm was broken, pinned beneath boots, his throat cut with his own blade. The mother was beaten with iron pokers until her skull cracked like a roasted chestnut. The children shrieked until their cries turned into gurgles, their small hands still clutching knives as the mob tore them apart. When at last the cellar fell silent, the flames had spread beyond control. The mob staggered into the night, covered in blood that was not all their own, coughing from smoke, trembling with what they had done. Behind them, the butcher's shop burned, walls collapsing, roof crashing inward, sending sparks spiraling into the storm. The screams of the dying family mingled with the roar of fire until nothing remained but ash and the sickly sweet scent of cooked flesh. London had purged its nightmare, but at a cost. Dozens of bodies lay broken in the mud outside, victims of the butcher's final frenzy. The mob had not triumphed cleanly. They had been dragged into the family's hell and scarred by it forever. As dawn broke, the charred ruins of the shop smoldered, black smoke rising into the gray sky like a curse. Those who survived whispered that justice had been done, but their eyes told another story, that of men and women who had stared too long into darkness and found it staring back. The climax had ended in fire and blood, but its echoes would haunt the city for years. For even as the butchers' bodies burned, the fear remained. Fear that the meat eaten, the bones buried, the children gone could never be undone. The fire consumed more than just the butcher's shop. By morning, Londoners stood before a pile of blackened rubble, smoke still curling like ghostly fingers into the gray dawn. The mob that had stormed the cellar returned in silence, their torches extinguished, their fury drained. What was left in their eyes was not triumph, it was horror, for they had seen what no man or woman should see, proof that evil had lived among them, not hidden in shadows, but thriving behind a market stall where children once bought scraps of meat with pennies. The parish priest, who had led the mob with trembling faith, now knelt in the mud, staring at the ruins as if expecting judgment to fall from the sky. His cross, bent and bloodied, hung loosely in his hand. He whispered prayers not for the dead butchers, nor for the innocents who had vanished, but for the souls of those who had taken part in the slaughter. He knew, as they all did, that something had shifted in the fabric of the city. They had eradicated monsters, yes, but in doing so, many had tasted the same frenzy, the same thirst for blood. When daylight spread, The wreckage was sifted. Bones charred beyond recognition jutted from the ashes. Some belonged to the butcher family, but others were far too many. Piles of blackened femurs, cracked skulls, teeth glinting white in soot. All evidence that the cellar had been filled with victims long before the mob had ever known the truth. Mothers collapsed upon seeing scraps of jewelry melted into bone, recognizing trinkets once worn by daughters who had vanished. A farmer fell to his knees clutching a burned scrap of fabric, the same as his missing son's work shirt. The city wailed, its grief echoing down every crooked lane and fog-choked alley. Authorities arrived late, as they so often did in those times. Constables pushed through the crowd, faces grim as they took in the devastation. The magistrate, pale with disgust, demanded order, but what law could apply to this? The butchers were dead, their crimes laid bare, but the question hung heavy. Who had truly delivered justice, the law or the mob? Neither answer satisfied, for London had not been protected by its courts, its guards, or its kings. It had been left vulnerable, feasting unknowingly upon its own, until desperation drove the people to take vengeance in their own hands. Rumors spread faster than fire. Some whispered that the butchers had not been human at all, but demons wearing human skin, granted unnatural strength to endure years of slaughter. Others swore the family had made a pact with the devil, trading their humanity for endless meat in a city starving through winters. Still others claimed the butchers cursed the mob with their dying breaths, that all who had raised hand against them would one day meet the same fate, cut down by blades and consumed by their neighbors. For weeks after, the market stood empty. The smell of burning flesh lingered, carried by wind into every household until it seemed to seep into clothing, hair, skin. People avoided meat altogether, turning to bread and gruel rather than risk another taste of horror. But hunger is relentless. Slowly butcher stalls reopened, though with trembling hands and watchful eyes. Customers demanded to see the animals alive before slaughter. Priests blessed carcasses before knives were taken to them. Suspicion filled every transaction. Was that beef truly from cow or something else hidden beneath? The butcher ruins became a site of both pilgrimage and fear. Some came to pray for the dead. Others came to spit curses into the ash. Children dared one another to step upon the scorched foundation at night, swearing they heard whispers of knives scraping or smelled sausages roasting in the dark. The parish rang its bells more often, each toll not for worship but as a warning. Evil could wear any face, even the face of a smiling family selling cuts of meat. Yet as months passed, the city's unease deepened. The mob that had ended the family's reign did not sleep soundly. Men woke screaming, seeing the children's bloodied eyes staring back at them. Women recoiled at their own hands, remembering the weight of stones and pokers used to crush skulls. Some could not eat without gagging. Others could not look upon their children without imagining them on a butcher's hook. Madness grew in their ranks as if the family's curse had indeed been real. One by one, those who had entered the cellar met grim fates. A dockworker fell into the Thames, dragged under by unseen hands, though he had been standing on dry boards. A washerwoman was found slumped in her home, throat slit with her own shears, no sign of intruder. The parish priest who had led them wasted away, refusing food, whispering that he heard knives scraping in the night. He was found dead at the altar, eyes wide, mouth stuffed with ash. People whispered that the butchers were taking their revenge from beyond the grave. Still, life in London demanded continuation. Hunger forced people to forget, or at least to pretend, but in hushed voices the tale passed. A warning not just of monsters, but of neighbors. For if such evil could thrive in the heart of a market, smiling as it sold flesh to mothers and children, then who could be trusted? A new fear took root, not of strangers in the dark, but of the butcher across the street, the grocer at the stall, even the friend who offered you a meal. The butchers were gone, but their shadow remained. London had not been cleansed, it had been scarred. The aftermath was not peace, but a silence heavy with dread, where every knife scrape and every pot of stew seemed to whisper, "Do you really know what you are eating?" London never forgot the horrors of the butcher family, though the city tried to bury them beneath the routines of daily life. The market reopened, cobblestones scrubbed, stalls cleaned, but the memory lingered like a phantom in every alley. People spoke in hushed tones of those who had vanished, and parents warned children not to stray near meat stalls that smelled faintly of smoke and rot. The ruins of the butcher's shop remained a grim landmark for months, charred beams jutting like bones from the earth, yet curiosity drew the brave and foolish alike. Some came to pray, others to gawk, and many to leave offerings, coins, scraps of meat, trinkets, to appease whatever spirit lingered. The priest who had led the mob into the cellar was gone, but his warnings echoed, carried on the wind through the narrow alleys. Never trust appearances. Never ignore the whisper of fear. The surviving citizens struggled with trauma. Merchants reported nightmares in which the butcher children smiled as they carved faces into slabs of meat. Parents awoke screaming, imagining knives hovering above their own family, and even the city's law enforcement found themselves hesitant to patrol Whitechapel at night. Folklore grew. Ballads told of the family's cruelty, songs that parents sang to children as both entertainment and caution. Playwrights dramatized the story, embellishing horrors beyond reality, yet each performance reinforced a truth the city could not deny. Evil had walked among them disguised as human. Meanwhile, some dark scholars and physicians took note, studying the psychological effects on those who had survived the night of the climax. Reports spoke of lingering paranoia, obsessive behaviors, and phobias that lasted decades. The story of the butchers was not simply one of crime. It was a study in the endurance of fear and the corrupting influence of witnessing atrocities firsthand. Years later, the descendants of those who had fought the butchers recalled tales from their parents and grandparents, warning their own children to be wary of kindness too smooth, of smiles too wide, of meat that seemed too fresh or rich. London rebuilt, markets thrived, and the city continued to feed itself. Yet a shadow always remained, whispering in the fog, reminding each generation that monsters could exist behind the most ordinary of faces. And though the butchers were gone, the scars they left on flesh, on mind, on memory, never healed, forever haunting the alleys, kitchens, and dreams of London. London had thought the butcher family's reign of terror ended with fire and blood, yet a darkness lingered that no flame could consume. The ruins of the shop smoldered for days, smoke curling into the fog as if carrying secrets upward into the indifferent sky. Neighbors reported strange occurrences, shadows moving where none should be, whispers echoing down alleys, a faint metallic scent in the air that vanished before investigation. Children whispered of seeing pale figures at the windows, sometimes smiling, sometimes screaming, always watching. Scholars who studied crime and human behavior were puzzled. They could not account for the psychological grip the butcher's story held over the city. Every survivor carried their own memory, every witness their own fear. Yet the bodies had been burned, the family dead, the mob victorious. And yet the disappearances continued. Orphans vanished from alleyways, street beggars failed to return home, and those who dared wander Whitechapel at night spoke of being followed, sometimes hearing cleavers scraping, faint laughter echoing from corners that held nothing. Attempts to explain these events through science failed. Physicians tested soils near the ruins, analyzed the remains, yet found nothing abnormal beyond the charred bones already accounted for. No poison, no contagion, no trace of unnatural substances, only the evidence of human cruelty that could not be quantified. Folklore quickly filled the gap. People spoke of curses placed by the butcher's dying breaths, the family's anger seeping into the soil, the walls, the very air. Some claimed the ashes from the burned cellar were toxic, carried by the wind to infect the living with nightmares, paranoia, and obsession. Others swore that taking even a single coin from the ruins would bring misfortune, sudden illness, or madness. These stories spread as both warning and fascination. Tourists, curiosity seekers, and thrill hunters ventured into Whitechapel, daring each other to peer into alleyways, sometimes touching the foundations of the ruined shop, only to flee screaming at imagined figures that seemed to rise from the fog. Even long after the city rebuilt and new stalls opened in the market, the scent of smoke and human decay was said to linger in the wind, subtle yet unmistakable to those who remembered. Scientists tried to rationalize the fear. Psychologists documented what they called collective trauma, a phenomenon where the population internalizes the horrors witnessed by a few and manifests it as shared hallucinations or mass anxiety. Yet even they could not explain the physical sensations reported. Cold hands on the shoulders of those walking alone at night, the scraping of steel on stone with no visible source, or the fleeting glimpse of a figure standing in the corner of a room that vanished when approached. The mystery became self-perpetuating, feeding upon the fear it had created. Rumors swirled that the butchers had allies, members of secret cults that ensured their work continued unseen, or that surviving children had been taken in by strangers to carry on the family legacy in other cities. These whispers could never be verified, yet they were powerful enough to haunt Londoners' dreams. Merchants reported stolen meat, portions missing from deliveries, or strange shapes in barrels that defied explanation. Families hesitated to buy from new stalls, haunted by the memory that anyone could be hiding the past behind a smile. Even the fog seemed tainted, some claimed, carrying with it the scent of human fat and smoke on certain nights, as if the city itself remembered the butchers and refused to let them be forgotten. For decades, attempts to study the case academically met with frustration. Every record of the Butcher family was incomplete, censored, or mysteriously vanished. Witness testimonies contradicted each other. Missing persons reports were lost. Parish registers burned in a fire whose cause was never explained. The official history recorded the family's end, but not the continued disappearances, the whispered fears, or the lingering presence that seemed to infect London's air. In time, the Butcher's story became legend, a tale told in hushed tones over hearths in taverns and at the edge of playgrounds. Children were warned that wandering too far could lead them to the hands of the family even after death. Adults spoke cautiously, knowing that acknowledgement of the curse might attract attention, though what attention remained unclear. Mystery thrived because evidence had been destroyed, witnesses eliminated, and terror etched itself into the city's collective memory more powerfully than proof ever could. And so the Butchers lived on, not in flesh, but in shadows, whispers, smoke, and fear, a haunting impossible to eradicate, a reminder that some crimes are never truly solved, and some horrors linger long after the perpetrators are gone. The fog over Whitechapel thickened with each passing night, carrying with it the memory of the Butcher family, a memory that refused to fade. Even decades later, people whispered of figures glimpsed in shadows, of knives flashing where no one stood, and of laughter echoing down alleyways where the city had long since rebuilt. Scholars, scientists, and priests alike attempted to rationalize these occurrences, yet every explanation fell short. The soil of the Butcher's ruin, tested repeatedly, held nothing beyond charred fragments of bone and ash, yet those who walked near it felt a chill, a brush of something unseen, as though the ground remembered the atrocities committed upon it. Children reported toys vanishing from their rooms, replaced by scraps of meat in shapes that defied understanding, and dogs howled at corners empty of visible threat. Folklore became lawless, spreading across generations. Parents would warn their children of the family, saying that even decades later their spirit could claim the unwary. Travelers entering London were told the story by innkeepers, each embellishing horrors beyond reality, yet all reinforcing the singular truth: the Butcher's evil had not died with them. Attempts to trace the family's lineage only deepened the mystery. Registers suggested children survived the fire, whisked away by unknown parties. Rumors of their presence in other cities circulated, of murders, disappearances, and uncanny markets, but verification was impossible. Scientists cataloged the psychological effects on the population, citing mass hysteria, post-traumatic stress, and paranoia. Yet even they could not explain the inexplicable: fleeting shadows, metallic scents, or faint cries that seemed to come from empty alleyways. The city adjusted, adopting protective rituals. Priests blessed all meat, charms were hidden in homes, and certain streets were avoided after dark. Yet the fear persisted, a subtle thrum in the heartbeat of London. In private homes, families whispered about the missing, the burned ruins, and the stories of those who had confronted the Butchers directly. Every so often, a new disappearance would occur: a child walking alone, a beggar near the old ruins, a traveler unwise enough to explore the foggy alleys. Nothing concrete ever emerged, yet the patterns unnerved the citizens, confirming what the folklore insisted: the Butcher's legacy was not contained within ashes. Even today, historians debate whether the evil was human or something darker. Letters and journals of the time describe incidents with precise horror. Meat purchased from unrelated butchers turned up with odd textures or faintly familiar shapes, and eyewitnesses claimed to see figures resembling the Butcher children in marketplaces far from London. Scientific study could not replicate these phenomena, leading to the unsettling conclusion that rational explanation alone could not account for all evidence. Mystery thrived where evidence failed. The Butchers had created not just carnage but an enduring enigma, one that intertwined with human psychology, folklore, and the city's collective memory. Scholars speculated on curses, spiritual possession, and even residual evil tied to places of intense trauma. Yet no one could confirm any supernatural element. Only note that the city's fear persisted with a persistence bordering on sentience. Whitechapel itself seemed to remember. Fog crept slower or thicker depending on the observer. Lights flickered in houses near the old butcher's ruins, and dogs reacted to invisible stimuli. The boundaries of rational thought faltered. Londoners began speaking of lessons learned, that evil is not always contained, that monsters can leave marks beyond death, and that some horrors are meant to haunt. The butcher's legacy became a cautionary tale not only of murder and cannibalism, but of the fragility of societal oversight, the perils of hunger, and the danger of turning a blind eye to the suffering of the weakest. Each retelling, whether by priest, playwright, or historian, reinforced the city's awareness that some crimes, some mysteries, cannot be solved entirely. They persist, feeding on memory and fear, ensuring that even as time passes, the shadow of the butchers remains. London never truly healed from the Butcher family's crimes. Though the streets were rebuilt, markets reopened, and life resumed, the memory of what had occurred lingered in every alley, every corner, every fog-laden street. Citizens spoke in whispers, recalling the smell of smoke, the glint of knives, and the faces of the vanished. Parents warned their children, merchants hesitated over the meat they sold, and travelers approached Whitechapel with caution, sensing that the past had not been buried, but only waiting. The ruins of the butcher's shop were long gone, replaced by ordinary buildings. Yet on nights when fog thickened and lamps flickered, those familiar with the story swore they could see shadows moving behind curtains, hear faint metallic scraping, and smell the sickly sweetness of human flesh lingering on the wind. Historians debated the truth of what happened, piecing together testimonies, parish records, and newspaper accounts. Yet discrepancies remained. The victims' identities were never fully known. The family's surviving children remained untraced, and rumors of the butcher's legacy spreading to other cities persisted. Londoners learned that horror does not vanish with death. Its memory infects minds, shaping fears, changing behaviors, and haunting generations. Families who had survived the mob's confrontation reported nightmares that would not end. Some claimed that in dreams the butchers stood before them, knives dripping, children's laughter echoing in empty corridors. Attempts to rationalize these visions failed. Psychologists of later centuries examined letters and journals describing these nightmares, concluding that trauma had woven itself into the city's consciousness, ensuring that every shadow could conceal a memory. Every sound could carry a threat. Every stranger could hide a monster. Even literature and theater kept the story alive. Playwrights dramatized the events with embellishments, but the essence, the terror, the horror of human cruelty, the collapse of societal oversight, remained. Londoners told these tales as warnings of curiosity, of hunger, of negligence. Scholars studying criminal history noted that the butcher's actions were not isolated. They were amplified by the city's blindness, the desperation of hunger, and the greed of those who unknowingly participated. In the end, the butchers became symbols of human capacity for evil, reminders that monsters can wear familiar faces, operate in plain sight, and leave scars that persist long after their bodies are gone. Ghost stories arose around Whitechapel, children daring each other to step on the site of the ruins, adults recalling shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Even as the city modernized, infrastructure replaced old streets and new generations arose who had not witnessed the horrors firsthand, the tales remained. Residents avoided certain alleys, superstition held sway, and a collective unease persisted in the areas once controlled by the family. London learned a harsh lesson. Destruction alone cannot cleanse evil, only awareness and memory can temper it. The butcher's story was repeated in classrooms, in pamphlets, in whispered warnings, and though the physical presence of the family ended in fire and blood, the psychological imprint remained indelible. People spoke of fear as a living thing, one that grows when unacknowledged, multiplies when ignored, and lingers when confronted. They spoke of the way a city could internalize horror, how every citizen became a witness, and how generations could inherit a story of violence as much as they inherit property or tradition. Even centuries later, historians and urban explorers visiting Whitechapel reported an unshakable feeling, the air heavy with dread, the fog seeming to thicken around them, the subtle impression that someone, or something, was watching. The city had not merely survived the butchers, it had been transformed. London was forever changed, a place where shadows are treated with respect, alleys are approached with caution, and meat is inspected with suspicion, a city haunted by a family who thrived on its ignorance. The passage of years did little to quiet the echoes of the butcher family's crimes. Londoners who had survived the horrors grew old carrying memories they could neither forget nor fully comprehend. Streets that once rang with the bustle of markets now whispered with the weight of the past. Travelers unfamiliar with the story felt uneasy in Whitechapel, sensing an inexplicable tension in the air, a vigilance inherited from generations who had learned to fear even ordinary shadows. Scholars documented persistent folklore, tales of fleeting figures, the smell of human flesh on foggy nights, and cries that seemed to come from empty alleyways. Psychologists studying survivors' descendants noted patterns of anxiety, paranoia, and heightened vigilance, an inheritance of fear that extended far beyond the victims themselves. Children grew up aware that curiosity could be fatal, that appearances can deceive, that evil may linger unseen. Plays and literature immortalized the butchers, blending fact and fiction, yet the essence remained. The terror of human cruelty and the fragility of societal oversight. Markets inspected by priests, homes warded with charms, and warnings whispered to children became a part of everyday life. A city forever cautious, forever haunted. Archaeologists later examining foundations of the butcher's ruins reported unusual soil composition. Faint traces of burnt organic matter, yet nothing conclusive, proof that even scientific inquiry could not fully explain the phenomena. Visitors swore they felt cold hands on shoulders, heard distant scraping, glimpsed shadows moving against the fog, confirming to many that the butcher's legacy was more than memory. It was a persistent, almost sentient presence. London had learned a lesson written in blood, fear, and memory. Evil, once unleashed, leaves scars that cannot be erased, shaping behavior, instilling caution, and haunting the innocent for generations. The butcher's story became a paradigm of the unspeakable, a testament to the fragility of civilization in the face of human depravity, and a reminder that sometimes destruction does not end horror. It preserves it, embedding it in the very fabric of the city, ensuring that even centuries later the names, acts, and shadows of the butcher family could never be forgotten.